On the morning they called me, the site manager's first words were, "No one else wants it." No greeting, no handshake, just a verdict. The university wing was weeks from being condemned. Concrete cracked like old porcelain, timelines torn apart, budget bleeding out faster than anyone could patch it. The architect had walked off. The engineers had stopped answering emails. And now, somehow, I was the one they thought would crawl into the wreckage and make it stand again. Not because they believed I could, not because they respected me, because in their eyes I was just a builder. The man you call when the problem is too ugly for polite company. The man who'd work through the night without asking why the ceiling was leaking or the walls were caving in. I stood at the edge of the site that first day, boots sinking into mud, staring up at a half-born structure, leaning like it was tired of holding itself together. The air smelled of damp cement, and something worse, failure. I could feel the way the place had been abandoned in spirit long before it had been abandoned in labor. From the second I walked through the chain-link gate, I wasn't greeted. Men in crisp shirts glanced at my boots, then at each other, like my presence was proof of how bad things had gotten. No one asked my name, they just handed me the blueprints. Heavy, rolled tight, the paper edges curling from neglect. The project manager didn't even look at me when he said, "Do what you can. It's not like you'll make it worse." It wasn't just insult. It was dismissal before I'd even begun. I wasn't supposed to be seen as anything more than a pair of hands. My mind, my years of experience, the quiet hours I'd spent studying designs most builders never looked twice at. None of it mattered to them. And yet, as I stood there tracing the lines on the blueprint with my thumb, I saw it. Beneath the mess, the mistakes, the cheap fixes, there was something worth saving. Something worth building right. Not for them. For the students who'd walk these halls. For the generations that would learn in rooms they hadn't been allowed to imagine yet. They thought they'd toss me the scraps of a dying project. I knew they just handed me the foundation of something they'd never see coming. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you? And if you're feeling the story, don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. They kept me on the fringes from the very start. Meetings were held behind glass doors, the kind you could see through but not hear through. A quiet reminder that the decisions shaping the building I was saving weren't meant for me. I would catch the faint movements of hands pointing at walls, red markers circling areas I'd already fixed, papers shuffling across polished tables I was never invited to sit at. When the doors opened, the people inside stepped around me, the way you step around scaffolding, something necessary but not worth a second glance. Plans were passed over my head, literally and figuratively. Roll after roll of updates changed hands above me, never to me. If instructions came my way, they were filtered through someone else's voice, someone else's authority. I wasn't trusted to hear the vision firsthand, as though my mind couldn't hold it, or my voice had no right to shape it. Sometimes, as I worked in the dust and wind, I'd hear them outside the site, professors, board members, the kind of people who wore their importance like a well-tailored suit. They laughed openly about the builder, as if I were just another piece of equipment they'd rented. They joked about how I didn't need to understand the bigger picture, that all I needed to know was where to pour the concrete. They spoke like my work was muscle without thought, a task without art. They had no idea that in my truck, under layers of paint-splattered tarps and heavy toolboxes, lay my own rolled-up sketches. Drawings I had made in quiet evenings, lit only by the soft hum of a desk lamp and the smell of coffee gone cold. My designs didn't just show walls and beams. They imagined light spilling across study tables, the echo of voices in lecture halls, the way footsteps would sound in corridors lined with oak. I knew where every window should face to catch the morning sun. I knew where a student might sit in silence, thinking, dreaming. I didn't need their permission to see the building in full. I didn't need their blessing to understand its soul. What they didn't realize was that the bigger picture they so carefully guarded wasn't bigger than mine. It was smaller, constricted by politics, budgets, and egos. Mine was built for people who would never know my name but would carry something of me in their daily lives without realizing it. The shadows they kept me in didn't weaken me. They sharpened me. Every time they turned their backs, I saw more clearly where this project could go. And though they didn't know it yet, the quietest man on that site was already building more than walls. He was building the part of the story they could never take credit for. The site was a different world after everyone left. By day, it was noise and orders, clipboards and cold glances. But at night, when the last car rolled off the gravel and the hum of voices faded into the distance, the building stood bare and breathing, like a wounded animal that didn't know if it could survive. I stayed when no one asked me to. I walked its skeleton with my hands in my pockets, letting my eyes trace every imperfection, every sagging joint, every careless choice someone else had made in haste. The engineers had left their mark in ways they didn't intend. Beams that bore too much weight on one side, supports that had been positioned inches off from where they should stand, concrete poured in weather too cold to bind properly. I could see the danger in the bones, the kind of danger you don't notice until it's too late. And so I fixed them, quietly, without fanfare. Not for their approval, but because I couldn't stand the thought of students sitting beneath a roof I didn't trust. Sometimes the fixes were so small they'd never notice, a plate added here, an angle shifted there, but together they changed everything. I reset the pitch of the lecture hall ceiling so morning light would pour across the seats instead of blinding the first row. I widened a doorway by 3 inches so that a wheelchair could pass through without scraping the frame. I rerouted a vent to carry fresh air into a corner that had been starved of circulation in the original plan. Each nail I drove, each beam I shifted, was a choice, a quiet refusal to let this place be just good enough. And though none of it bore my signature, every inch of it bore my intent. These weren't changes for the university's pride or the architect's portfolio. They were for the people who'd never see the blueprints, who'd never know that someone had thought of them in the dead of night, when no one was watching. The deeper I worked, the more I began to feel something unexpected: ownership. Not of the building as a job, but of the building as a promise. They had brought me in to save a failing project. What I was really doing was building the heart of something they didn't deserve to claim. By the time the first light of morning spilled over the steel beams, I would be gone, my truck pulling away before the others arrived. To them, it looked as though the site had simply held its ground overnight. But I knew better. The building was growing stronger, and so was my resolve. It happened on a morning when the sky was the color of raw steel, the kind of day that feels too cold for gratitude. I had been on site since before dawn, tightening the last bolts on a support frame I had redesigned myself, a design that had solved the ventilation problem the original plans had created. I was still wiping grit from my hands when I saw the dean step onto the lot, his polished shoes avoiding the mud with practiced precision. The architect was beside him, suit pressed, hair in place, the faintest glimmer of self-satisfaction in his stride. They stopped near the lecture hall entrance, the one I'd spent 3 nights adjusting so sunlight would fall evenly across the rows. The dean reached out and clasped the architect's hand with a warmth I had never seen directed at anyone in work boots. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught the phrase as it landed like a stone in my gut. "You're our savior." From where I stood, just a few feet away, I could see the rolled blueprint in the architect's arm. It was the same set I had annotated in pencil weeks ago, the same sketches I had slipped onto the drafting table late at night when the site was empty. My lines, my corrections, my fixes, and his name printed neatly at the bottom. The worst part wasn't that he had taken credit, it was how natural it felt to them. As if the transfer of ownership over my work was as obvious as gravity. My contribution didn't even register as something that could belong to me. To them, I was part of the scenery, a tool, something you pick up, use, and put down without remembering its weight in your hand. I felt the sting, but I swallowed it whole, letting it settle deep where no one could see. Because in that moment I understood something dangerous. They weren't going to give me credit because they didn't think I needed it. They believed my place was in the dust, invisible but useful, and as long as the building stood, The names carved into the plaques would be theirs. And yet, standing there, boots planted in the mud, blueprint under my arm, I made a quiet promise. They could keep their praise, their photographs, their headlines. I wasn't building this for them. My work didn't need their signatures to matter. I would leave my mark in places they couldn't erase, in the light that filled the rooms, in the quiet corners where students would think their first great thoughts, in the steel that would hold decades of laughter, struggle, and hope. They could not see me now, but one day they would have no choice. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the site shifted from noise to a strange in-between quiet. Not quite the end of the day, but close enough that people started packing up without rushing. I was hauling a crate of tools through the side entrance of the main hall, boots echoing on the unfinished floor when I slowed. Voices. They were just around the bend, in the narrow hallway that led to the administrative offices. I didn't mean to listen at first, but the words cut clean through the air, sharp and unguarded. A man's voice, steady, confident. A professor I'd seen before, the type who always walked with a folder tucked under his arm, as if the world might forget he was important without it. "When it's done," he said, "no one will remember who laid the bricks." There was a burst of laughter, the kind that doesn't even need a punchline. Another voice chimed in, lighter, almost mocking. "That's the point. People don't remember hands, they remember names." More laughter followed, and in it there was no hesitation, no guilt. Just the easy camaraderie of people who all agreed on one thing, that the work only mattered once it could be claimed by someone with the right title. I stayed still, half hidden in the shadows of the doorway, gripping the handle of my toolbox so hard the metal bit into my palm. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just arrogance. This was a plan. It was how they designed the story from the beginning. The building would stand, the donors and leaders would smile for the cameras, and the people who poured its concrete, aligned its beams, brought it from a heap of steel to a place of light, would dissolve into silence. The truth sank into me heavy and cold. They didn't see erasing us as cruelty. They saw it as natural order. The idea that a builder could be remembered for more than a paycheck was absurd to them, and if anyone suggested otherwise, they'd laugh it off as easily as they laughed in that hallway. I walked away before they could see me, not because I couldn't face them, but because I needed the weight of that moment to settle in. It was clarity, and clarity can be dangerous. Their words didn't just insult me. They told me exactly what I was up against. They confirmed that every ounce of care I put into this building would be buried under a story they'd rewrite without me. But here's the thing about bricks. You can't lay them without leaving your fingerprint in the mortar. They might not see it now. They might even convince themselves it's not there. But years from now, when the plaster cracks just enough for the truth to show, my mark will still be waiting. That day, walking back into the dust and half-light of the site, I stopped caring about their version of the story. I started building mine. It started small, almost without me noticing. A shipment of wood arrived one morning. The kind they'd ordered, cheap and light, the kind that warps in the first damp season. I could already picture it swelling in the door frames, squealing against the hinges, betraying the work before the building had even had a chance to age. I didn't argue. I just went to my own supplier that weekend and paid, in cash, for oak that would hold its shape for decades. When no one was watching, I swapped it in. From there, it became a quiet habit. Stronger bolts, the kind that wouldn't rust out when the rain came sideways. Brackets reinforced in places no inspector would ever look, but that I knew would bear the weight of generations leaning on them. I bought tiles that would feel cool underfoot in summer and warm in winter. I recut beams so that they'd join seamlessly, not just well enough to pass a quick glance. Every change was invisible to the untrained eye, but I knew. I could walk the site and feel the difference under my boots, hear the difference in the way the walls carried sound. It was like leaving a secret trail of my own making, a quiet resistance against the idea that this place was just another job to be completed and forgotten. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It wasn't about praise or recognition or forcing my name into their story. I had accepted that my name wouldn't be there, But if my name was going to be absent, my fingerprint would still be everywhere, in the grain of the wood that wouldn't splinter under the hands of a first-year student moving in her desk, in the bolts that would still hold decades after the photographs of the ribbon cutting had yellowed, in the sunlight that would spill into the lecture hall exactly the way I'd intended, no matter how many new deans and architects claimed to have designed it. I paid for it all quietly. No receipts to the university, no notes in the budget. Every cost came out of my own pocket, each dollar buying not just materials, but a piece of permanence. It was like tucking small pieces of myself into the very bones of the place. If they wanted to erase me, they would have to tear the building down to do it. And there was something freeing in that. I no longer worked for them. I no longer answered to their clipped instructions and their sideways glances. I worked for the building, for the people who would walk through it without ever knowing they were stepping into a space made stronger by someone who refused to do it halfway. By the time the walls began to close in, by the time the roof was set, and the first coat of paint dulled the raw beauty of the wood, I knew it was no longer theirs. On paper, maybe. In the speeches, certainly. But in truth, in the heartbeat of the structure, it belonged to the man who built it, as if it would outlive them all. It was a Sunday evening when my daughter came by, the kind of visit where she lets herself in without knocking, because she knows I'll be at the kitchen table, hands still smelling faintly of sawdust. She set down a grocery bag, glanced at the scattered sketches across the table, and asked in that careful tone she uses when she's not sure she wants the answer, "Is this the building you've been working on all these months?" I nodded, sliding one of the drawings toward her. It was the lecture hall, my lecture hall, though no one else would call it that. Sunlight angled through the tall windows I had redesigned, washing over rows of seats built wide enough for comfort, close enough for conversation. She studied it for a moment, her eyes tracing the lines I had drawn late at night when the house was silent. "Why do you care so much?" she asked finally. "They don't. From what you've told me, they don't even see you. So why keep giving them more than they're paying for?" I could hear the quiet frustration in her voice, the same frustration that had once been mine, before I'd learned to stop expecting anything from them. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the grain of the wood beneath my hands. "Because," I said slowly, "sometimes you build for the people who'll use it, not for the ones who'll sign the papers." She frowned, as if she wanted to challenge me, but I could see her thinking about it. I told her how I imagined the students walking into the East Wing for the first time, how I'd designed alcoves for quiet study and open spaces for debate. I told her about the beams strong enough to bear not just the weight of the roof, but the weight of decades of footsteps, storms, and history. I told her about the feeling of working late, alone, knowing every decision I made was shaping a place that might hold someone's most important day. Her eyes softened, but there was still doubt in them, the kind that comes from seeing too many times how the world fails the people who deserve better. She didn't say it, but I knew what she was thinking, that it wasn't fair, that I was pouring myself into something that would never have my name on it, that no matter how perfect the building was, the speeches would thank everyone but me. And maybe she was right. But the truth was, I wasn't chasing fairness. Fairness was a currency I'd stopped believing in a long time ago. What I wanted, what I needed, was to know that somewhere out there, long after I was gone, there would be a place that stood because I'd made it strong. Before she left, she lingered at the doorway, looking back at the sketches still spread across the table. "You know they'll never admit it was you," she said quietly. I smiled at that, not because it was untrue, but because I'd already made peace with it. "They don't have to," I said. "The building will." It was one of those afternoons when the air itself felt heavy, pressing against the skin, carrying the smell of wet plaster and steel dust. I had been working in the East Wing, tightening the last set of vents I'd rerouted, a fix that had cost me 3 sleepless nights, hunched over makeshift blueprints on my kitchen table, calculating airflow and pressure until the numbers stopped swimming in front of my eyes. The original design would have left whole sections of the building stifling in summer, airless in winter. My design would make the rooms breathe. I was climbing down from the ladder when I heard the laughter, light and satisfied, drifting from the open doorway of the conference room. I didn't think much of it until I caught a phrase, my phrase, the exact description I had used when explaining the fix to one of the foremen the week before. I stepped closer. The architect was standing at the head of the table, sleeves rolled just enough to look busy without being soiled by the work. He was talking to the dean, a rolled-up sheet in his hand, my revised vent layout, the one with my pencil marks, still faintly visible where I'd worked out the measurements. "It's a cleaner solution," he said, tapping the page. "I thought of it after reviewing the initial plans again." The dean smiled like a man being handed a gift, already speaking about how the university would be grateful for the architect's keen eye and technical precision. Around the table, heads nodded in polite approval, and with each nod I felt something inside me tighten, not rage exactly, but something deeper, heavier, a silence that wanted to split open. I didn't say a word. I didn't step into the room and call him a liar. I didn't throw the blueprints down and demand they see the truth, because in that moment, I understood something with startling clarity. I was never going to win their game. The rules were written by people who had never lifted a beam or driven a nail, and they were designed to keep the hands that built invisible. And so I stopped trying to play it. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't just build their dream, I'd build mine inside it. A hidden vision threaded through their structure like veins under the skin. Spaces they hadn't asked for, but would never think to remove. Spaces made for the ones who would actually live and learn here. Places of light, strength, and quiet welcome that no speech or plaque could truly claim as theirs. I walked out of that conference room doorway without being seen, without being missed, and yet with a plan that would change everything. If they wanted the glory, they could have it. I would take something far greater, permanence. My name might never be on the program, but my work would be written into the building itself, in ways they couldn't undo without dismantling the heart of the place. And once I knew that, the game was over for them, and just beginning for me. The East Wing was supposed to be nothing more than a connector, a stretch of hallway with a few rooms tacked on, a functional afterthought to justify the symmetry of the plans. No one in the meeting spoke of it with interest. No one visited it unless they had to. It was the kind of place projects forget about, where budgets shrink and corners are cut without hesitation. That suited me perfectly. In their neglect, I found freedom. While they obsessed over the grand lecture hall and the ceremonial entrance, I began quietly reshaping the East Wing into something they would never have dared to design. I started with the floors, replacing the bland industrial tile they'd ordered with deep-veined marble I sourced myself, driving hours to a quarry I trusted, paying for the slabs out of my own pocket. I chose a shade that caught light in a way that shifted with the day, pale and golden in the morning, rich and warm by dusk. The alcoves came next. In the original plans, the walls were flat, uninterrupted. Designed for efficiency, not humanity, I carved them back, creating curved recesses just wide enough for a bench and a small table. I positioned them so two people could sit there and speak in low voices, their words cradled by the architecture itself. I imagined students leaning close over notebooks, friends finding a quiet place between classes, a weary professor pausing to breathe before the next lecture. And then there was the reading room. It hadn't existed in their design at all. On paper, it was just a storage space, but I stripped it bare and rebuilt it from the bones up. I lined the walls with shelves, their edges hand-sanded so they were smooth to the touch. I chose warm lighting that fell like afternoon sun, even on the darkest winter days. By the time I was done, the shelves weren't empty. I had already begun stocking them with books from my own collection, titles I'd carried with me through decades, from weathered engineering manuals to poetry anthologies. They were pieces of my own life, left there without ceremony, waiting for hands that might need them. I made these changes without permission, without paperwork, and without telling a soul. They would see them eventually, of course, but by then it would be too late to undo them without drawing attention to the fact that they hadn't been part of the plan. And the truth was, they wouldn't dare. Once the beauty was there, once people walked those halls and felt it, removing it would look like vandalism. Every night, after the others had gone, I'd wander the east wing, running my hands over the marble, testing the alcove benches for comfort, brushing dust from the spines of the books. It felt less like I was building a space and more like I was planting something, a garden in the middle of a desert they didn't even realize they'd abandoned. And in the quiet, I began to understand the real victory I was after. Not recognition, not even gratitude, but knowing that somewhere in this cold machine of a project, there would be a place that carried warmth, because I put it there, a place that couldn't be erased without tearing out the soul of the building itself. The east wing was nearly complete when I realized there was one last thing I needed to do to seal it, not just in stone and wood, but in memory. I had built it with my own hands, shaped it with my own money, filled it with pieces of my own life. But I knew how their story would be told when the building opened. The names on the donor list would shine and mine would never be there. That's when I remembered the foundation. Years ago, after a big job that paid better than I'd expected, I'd set it up quietly, a way to fund scholarships, restore old community buildings, and help the kinds of projects that rarely make headlines. I'd kept it separate from my name, a shadow ledger that allowed me to give without being pulled into the politics of credit. No one in the university knew it existed. I called the director, a friend who owed me nothing but trusted me enough not to ask questions. I told him the foundation would make a private donation to the university, earmarked solely for the completion of the East Wing. It would cover every last expense, finishing work, furnishings, whatever was needed to make it ready for opening day. But there was one condition, non-negotiable, a plaque at the entrance, carved into stone, bearing the name of the donor. They didn't hesitate. The dean accepted within hours, sending back a gracious, glowing letter about the generosity of anonymous benefactors who believed in the vision of the project. I almost laughed when I read it. They didn't realize the donor and the builder were the same man. In their eyes, this was a stroke of good fortune, some mysterious patron swooping in to polish the final jewel in their crown. They never suspected that the hands that signed the check were the same ones that had set every beam and laid every marble tile. As the work wound down, I'd walk through the east wing late at night and picture it. The plaque mounted at the entrance, my name cut deep into the stone, as permanent as the foundation beneath it. They could tell whatever story they wanted in the papers, in the speeches, in the history books. It wouldn't matter. Every person who stepped into that wing would see the truth first, before they heard a single word. And maybe, years from now, someone would run their fingers over the letters, wondering who I was. Maybe they'd notice the way the alcoves fit a conversation perfectly, or how the light fell across the reading tables just right in the late afternoon. Maybe they'd realize the building had been shaped, not by a committee, but by someone who understood what it meant to build something meant to last. They would never know how close they came to erasing me. They would never know that they had carried my name into their grand opening with their own hands. And that was the sweetest part. They were going to deliver the truth themselves, thinking it was theirs to give. The morning of the ceremony broke crisp and cold, the kind of air that feels sharper than it should, as if the day itself knows something is about to be cut open. The east wing gleamed in the pale sunlight, its marble floors polished to a sheen, its windows throwing gold into the courtyard. Every line, every angle, every detail had passed through my hands, but today all of that belonged to them, at least in the story they'd prepared to tell. I arrived early before the crowd, standing in the shadow of the building as crews set up rows of folding chairs and angled the podium so the photographs would catch the grand facade in the background. Soon, the first guests trickled in, professors in heavy coats, board members with their polished smiles, donors in tailored suits that caught the light just so. They moved through the space as though it were theirs, touching the walls, commenting on the craftsmanship without a single glance toward the man who had placed every piece. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, The courtyard was full. The dean stood front and center, flanked by the architect and the university president. Cameramen adjusted their lenses, leaning into the best angles for the moment that was about to come. At the heart of it all, just to the right of the podium, the plaque waited under its deep blue cloth, the one they thought would unveil the name of a faceless benefactor who had written a check and nothing more. I stayed in the back, wearing my work jacket, the same one I'd worn on countless days here, the cuffs frayed, the pockets heavy with the weight of tools I didn't need today. No one looked at me twice. To them, I was just part of the background, a leftover piece of the construction crew who hadn't realized the job was over. As the speeches began, the architect spoke of vision. The dean spoke of resilience and collaboration. The president spoke of generosity, praising the unnamed donor who had ensured the wing's completion. They spoke as though they were delivering the final chapter of a story they alone had written, unaware that the real ending was standing 20 feet away, silent, watching. From where I stood, I could see the blue cloth stirring faintly in the breeze, the shape of the engraved letters pressed beneath it. My name. Waiting. Stone and steel, and years of my life condensed into a moment they thought belonged entirely to them. I didn't feel anger anymore. That had burned out long ago, replaced by something steadier, something heavier. This was no longer about taking back what they had tried to erase. It was about letting the truth stand on its own, carved into the building in a way that no meeting, no budget, no committee could ever undo. And as the dean stepped forward, reaching for the corner of the cloth, I felt the stillness of the crowd settle around us like the pause before the first strike of a hammer. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The dean took hold of the blue cloth with both hands, his smile fixed for the cameras, his voice rising into the kind of polished sentence meant to live in the university archives. And now it is my honor to reveal the name of the generous benefactor whose support made this dream a reality. With a practiced flourish, he pulled the cloth away. The fabric fell like water to the ground, and the words beneath it caught the pale winter light. The East Wing, dedicated to the vision and generosity of my name. For the first time all morning, no one spoke. The air seemed to pause. The click of camera shutters slowed, then stopped entirely. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes turning, searching the crowd, searching for the name they had just read. The architect's smile faltered first. It was subtle, but I saw it. The corners of his mouth tightening, the smooth confidence slipping just enough to betray the thought forming behind his eyes. No, that's not possible. The dean glanced over at him, confusion flickering like a shadow, then looked back toward the audience, scanning for some suited figure stepping forward to claim the moment. No one moved. They expected the donor to be a man in polished shoes, not a figure standing in the back in a worn work jacket dusted with years of labor. I didn't move either. I let them look. I let the silence stretch, filling every corner of the courtyard until it became impossible to ignore. Somewhere near the front, a professor who had once laughed about the builder squinted toward me, his expression changing slowly as the pieces fell into place. A few heads turned with him, and then a few more. It was not a dramatic rush of recognition. No gasps, no sudden exclamations. It was slower, heavier, like watching a curtain drop not on a stage, but in their minds. They were realizing that the man they had dismissed, overlooked, and spoken over was the same man whose name was now etched into the very stone they had come to celebrate. The dean cleared his throat, fumbling for the next line in his speech. He spoke of humble generosity and extraordinary vision, but the words felt thin now, stripped of the comfort of anonymity. The cameras clicked again, but they weren't only pointed at the plaque anymore. A few had turned my way. I didn't step forward. I didn't wave or nod or do anything to claim more of the moment than what was already mine. The building had already done the claiming for me. My name was there, unmovable, carved into the entrance they would walk through for decades. No speech could take that away. And in that suspended silence, before the applause began, before they could rewrite this in their heads into something more palatable, I let them sit with the truth. The man they had never truly seen had been here the whole time. building not just their dream, but a piece of himself they could never erase. The sound moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Whispers, not the polite kind exchanged during ceremonies, but the sharp, breathless kind born from sudden understanding. Faces turned toward me, and then back to the plaque, as if comparing the two would somehow make the truth easier to grasp. Professors who had passed me 100 times without acknowledgement were now staring like they were seeing me for the first time. The dean's eyes finally landed on me. He blinked as though he was trying to place my face in the wrong part of his memory. "You?" His voice caught. "You're the donor?" I didn't step forward. I didn't bow my head. I simply nodded once. The motion felt heavier than any speech I could have prepared. "And the builder," I said quietly. My voice didn't need to rise above the noise. The silence it created was enough. That silence was unlike anything I had ever heard. Not empty, not awkward, but full, dense with the weight of everything unspoken between us. The architect's gaze dropped to the ground, his hands tightening around the rolled papers he was holding. A few of the professors shifted uncomfortably, their polished shoes scuffing against the marble they had never noticed before. It wasn't pride that rose in me then. Pride needs witnesses. This was something else, a deep, steady sense of completion. For months they had built their version of this place in words and photographs, in budget sheets and donor lists. I had built mine in wood and steel, in light and air, in choices that would outlast all of us. Now the two versions stood in the same space, and there was no mistaking which one would remain. No one clapped. Not yet. They were still processing the idea that the man they'd overlooked, the man who had carried their forgotten project on his back, was the same one who had funded it into existence. And maybe some of them didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was easier to think of me as one or the other, the donor or the builder, because accepting both meant they had been wrong about me from the start. I could see it on their faces, the quiet unraveling of their own stories. The builder they'd called just the muscle had been holding the blueprint of the future all along, and not just in his hands, but in his mind, his time, his money, his life. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The plaque said enough. The building said more. And the rest, the shame, the respect, the whispered apologies that might come years too late, could stay with them. I didn't wait for applause or questions. I didn't reach for the microphone or take the podium they would have offered me now. Speeches are for people who need to be heard. I had spent months letting my work speak in a voice stronger than any I could conjure in that moment. So instead, I turned and walked toward the entrance of the east wing. The sound of my boots on the marble was the only thing breaking the stunned quiet. At first I thought I might walk alone, but slowly the shuffle of footsteps began behind me. They followed the dean, the professors, the architect whose face had gone pale, the donors whose names were etched on other parts of the building. The cameras followed too, though their lenses seemed unsure where to aim. We stepped into the light-filled corridor. The air inside, different from the chill of the courtyard, warmer, softer, carrying that faint scent of new wood and fresh paint. Their voices, still hushed, echoed back at them in the way I had designed, the sound full and even, not harsh or hollow. I saw their eyes lift to the curve of the alcoves, tracing the edges as if noticing them for the first time. One of the professors stopped for a moment, running a hand along the smooth bench built into the wall, his brow furrowing in quiet recognition of its comfort. No one spoke, but I could feel the shift, that moment when admiration catches up with realization. They began to notice the details. The way the marble floor shifted in tone as the light changed, the way the spacing of the windows made the hallway feel like it was breathing with the day. They saw the reading room and stepped inside without invitation, their fingers grazing the spines of books they didn't know were already waiting for them. The architect lingered near the doorway, his eyes moving over the room with an expression I couldn't quite name. Part disbelief, part something closer to shame. He knew none of this had been in the original plans. He knew because he had once approved those plans. stripping away the very elements he was now standing inside. I kept walking, letting them take it in at their own pace. I didn't need to point out what was mine. I didn't need to narrate the choices I'd made, or tell them how many nights I'd stood exactly where they were standing now, imagining this moment. The truth was in the air they breathed, in the way the space invited them to slow down without realizing it, in the way it already felt like it had been here far longer than it had. Justice didn't arrive with fanfare. It didn't need the swell of applause or the weight of an official acknowledgement. It was here, in the quiet steps they took on floors I'd paid for, in the pages they turned in books I'd placed, in the pause between their words, when they understood they had underestimated not just the work, but the man who had made it possible. I didn't look back to see their faces. I didn't have to. The building had already told them everything I could ever want them to know. Years have passed since that day, but the East Wing still greets me like an old friend whenever I walk through its doors. I've seen it in every season now, bathed in the low gold of autumn afternoons, holding the cool hush of winter mornings, alive with the energy of spring when the windows are open and the breeze carries the sound of footsteps and laughter. And each time I cross the threshold, I see it, my name carved deep into the stone at the entrance, not as an afterthought, not as a footnote, but as part of the foundation itself. Students pass it every day, some glancing at it without thought, others slowing just enough to read it, their lips forming the syllables. They don't know the politics, the meetings, the petty games that almost kept it from being there. They don't know the quiet nights I spent here alone, or the money I poured into details no one asked for but everyone now benefits from. They don't need to. The stone doesn't tell the whole story, but it tells enough. To them, I'm more than a builder, more than a donor. My name stands as proof that someone cared enough to make this place not just functional, but worthy. Someone saw beyond deadlines and budgets, beyond titles and ceremonies, and built something meant to hold people as much as it held walls. Sometimes I linger in the alcoves I carved myself, listening to the low hum of conversation. Sometimes I step into the reading room and see a student with their head bent over a book from my own collection, not knowing the hands that once turned those pages decades before them. In those moments, I feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing I didn't just leave a mark, I left a presence. I think back to the way they once spoke about me, the laughter in the hallways, the certainty that no one would remember who laid the bricks. They were wrong. They'll be gone one day. The professors, the board members, the architect whose smile faded when the plaque was revealed. Their names will fade from the directories, their photographs will yellow in the archives, but my work will remain, my name will remain. I didn't wait for their invitation to sit at their table. I built the table. I built the chairs. I built the room around them. And every time someone walks through that door, whether they notice it or not, they are stepping into a space shaped by someone who refused to be erased. And that will outlast every single one of them.